All right, so let's get started. Thank you everybody for joining and welcome to the webinar. My name is Roisin Mortimer. I'm from Earthworm Foundation and I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar. Great to have so many of you dialed in. I'm aware that we had over 400 people respond to the RSVP, so not sure how many we have here today, but in any case, it's great to see a good turnout. As you can see on the screen, we're here today to share knowledge and to discuss what companies are doing to meet deforestation-free supply chain commitments. So just to the next slide, thanks. Quickly, I'll just introduce Earthworm Foundation for those of you who are not so familiar with us or our work. We're working in supply chains in key places to improve environmental and social conditions from a lot on the ground. So a lot of our work is right at the upstream end of supply chains, but we do work on supply chains all the way through to the consumer. We're about 20 years old now as an organization. Used to be called the Forest Trust or TFT. And we're made up of about 220 people. We work with around 16 locations and many different commodities. So just quickly run through our speakers and the agenda today before we get started. Myself, Roisin, my colleague Rob will be speaking first up. So he's director at Earthworm Foundation, and he'll be setting the scene for us, highlighting the importance of deforestation verification and clarifying where we're at today. We'll also have from Mighty Earth, and he'll be sharing his point of view on where companies are at and where they should be prioritizing to take action on address deforestation in supply chains. We'll have Emily Kunen from Nestlé, who will be explaining how they are carrying out deforestation verification in practice and highlight challenges that they're facing that they feel could be overcome with increased collaboration from other actors. Then we'll have Daniel Prakarsa from GAR, who will share how they're carrying out no deforestation verification in the field, so at the producer plantation end of supply chains. And finally, we'll have Justin Adams from Tropical Forest Alliance, who's going to speak to us about the need for collective action to address deforestation. So this is our lineup for today. We'll just go over to the next slide. So why this webinar and why now? I'm aware that there are a lot of webinars happening during these times of travel restrictions. So again, thank you all for making the time for this one. For us, it was very relevant given that so many companies have made commitments to verifying deforestation-free supply chains, and a lot of those for December this year, so just 6 months away from the deadline. And in parallel, we're all continuing to see so much forest loss around the world. So it's easy to think that nobody is doing anything. In the next hour, we would like to share examples of what actors are doing today, what needs to be taken up, evolved, and worked on by all of us to start having a more visible impact curbing forest loss across the supply chain. We've been progressing our work here at Earthworm and with our members on no deforestation verification. And we realize that we often don't always know what other actors are doing in this space. And also those actors are not always aware of what we or other companies are doing. And so that's really the objective for today, about what we and other key stakeholders in this space are prioritizing, with the aim to firstly identify specific opportunities for increased collaboration across the industry. And secondly, to inspire increased action in this space, accelerating progress to meet these commitments. The speakers will be sharing some examples that just need to be repeated to have a real impact and start changing the status quo, as well as, of course, sharing challenges where we've identified that collective action really needs to happen to overcome these challenges. Just a quick note to mention that we, of course, are focusing on deforestation verification today. We only have 1 hour. Obviously, this is just part of a bigger picture to addressing deforestation and looking at drivers. Also need to be addressing development on peatlands, and of course to recognise the importance of the exploitation aspect of a lot of company commitments, so on the social and the labour side of things. But yeah, we will be focusing on deforestation verification for the next hour or so. Just to summarise, our speakers will be looking at the following questions, or addressing these questions. So how does no deforestation verification work in practice? Where are the key challenges? What are companies doing about parts of the palm oil supply chain that will not be verified by December 2020? How does supply chain verification work interact with broader collaborative approaches? And how can it pave the way for collective action? So just finally, so next slide, please. Just a couple of quick housekeeping, and then we'll get started. We'll have 2 Q&A sessions. We'll have one after the first 3 speakers, so after Emily Kunen from Nestlé, and then we'll have one at the end after all of our speakers. And so please send your questions as you think of them. Please send them in the chat and just put the @ symbol and the name of the person if it's to someone specifically, and then we'll address those in the sessions for Q&A. So without further information, we'll get started with Rob now from Earthworm Foundation. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Roisin. Hello, everyone, and I'll echo Roisin's welcome. Happy to have you all here today to discuss what I believe is a really important topic. I've got a few slides to go through to be a bit more illustrative of some of the work and observations that we've had at Earthworm Foundation. I'll particularly look at why no deforestation commitments were made initially, some of the innovations that have really come out of no deforestation commitments, and illustrate how one innovation in particular is helping companies to verify no deforestation. About 10 years ago, actually, it's almost to the date, that following significant NGO pressure and also consumer pressure, companies started to make no deforestation commitments. Today, they represent a groundswell of commitment, and in palm oil alone, there's over 300 commitments to source palm oil that isn't linked to deforestation. Over the years, since 2010, the commitments have spread into timber and pulp, soy, cattle, and a whole host of other raw materials. We've also seen an expansion of these no deforestation commitments beyond just by companies, fast-moving goods companies, to governments and to the financial institutions. Despite these commitments, however, there's been a continuance of forest loss globally, and it leaves us lots of room for improvement going forward. For example, the State of the Forest report that was released just a couple of weeks ago by the Food and Agricultural Organization indicates that we lost 10 million hectares of forest globally in 5 years alone. That's an area about the same size as Iceland. One of the core drivers of this forest loss is our need to produce more food. And there are estimates that we need to produce 60% more food than we produce today by 2050 to feed 10 billion people. And in the tropical and subtropical areas of the world, where forests are notoriously known for their value for biodiversity, for carbon, for rural livelihoods, agricultural expansion over the past few decades has been very high. And today, such expansion for food and fuel is estimated to cause 2/3 of all deforestation in that zone. But despite all of those sort of staggering statistics of forest loss, really importantly, no deforestation commitments have triggered a number of innovations. Firstly, and perhaps across all of these 3 buckets of innovations I'm picking on today, has been that stakeholders are coming together. And firstly, they came together to really find approaches that were practical, pragmatic, to use on the ground, that companies could use to implement or operationalize their no deforestation commitments. And I think the high carbon stock approach is a good example of this. There's also been a range of multi-stakeholder fora, workshops, groups that have been forming over the last couple of years, really trying to tackle some of those really difficult issues of no deforestation commitments. And I think some of the speakers will touch on that today. And thirdly, has been a wealth of data. The accessibility to data from space, from data from the ground, has just expanded. And these are important data points that we can use to better inform our actions to verify no deforestation. And it's this third one that I'll pick on a little bit more to explain a little bit of the journey that we've gone through at Earthworm with a number of companies to verify no deforestation commitments. In advancing the deforestation verification, we've had that exceptional increase in Earth observation data availability, whether that be optical data or radar data. All of this data has now become available for companies to use. A second part has been the use of machine learning techniques and cloud computing space. Without these types of technology, having lots of data is largely meaningless. And so having the ability to use those technologies to process vast amounts of data has helped us to identify what's happening on the ground. And thirdly, and most importantly, following those no deforestation commitments has been the work of companies to get transparency back through their supply chain. Who are my suppliers, direct and indirect? Where is the palm oil mills and beyond in some cases? Born out of that need for companies to verify their no deforestation commitments, Earthworm started a partnership with Airbus back in 2015. And really that partnership is looking to combine different expertise. Earthworm's knowledge on the ground and experience in supply chains, particularly in palm, and then Airbus's experience and knowledge of using machine learning techniques, cloud computing space, processing data that small NGOs like Earthworm Foundation could never be able to do. We brought these two worlds together and we called the innovation Starling. And today Starling is supporting a whole host of companies implement their no deforestation commitments, from Nestlé to Racket Banquisa, Ferrero, and a whole host of other companies that are really taking the charge on finding out what's happening in their supply chain. But also, interestingly, governments are coming forward and looking for better, more accurate data sources so that they can take action on land that they're responsible for managing. Underpinning Starling, as I've touched on already, is kind of what you see on the top of the screen here is just a large satellite image, and then being able to transform this into information that is then actually usable. And I think that's a critical part of what Starling brings to supporting actors address deforestation. Can we move to the next? Beyond just identifying where forest is and where forest isn't, where the palm oil is, where the pulp and paper plantations are, important to this is where are we losing the forest. And Starling, unfortunately, sees a lot of the perhaps not the good stuff happening around the world. And we see where deforestation is happening in a large situation, where you have thousands of hectares that have been cleared within weeks or months. And then we also see the small-scale deforestation that is of increasing concern, and I think many of the stakeholders, particularly in palm, are starting to recognise that deforestation, perhaps led by small actors, is of growing interest. To exemplify that has been there's been Starling's identification. Sorry, hearing a lot of feedback. To exemplify that, Starling in 2019 identified that 320,000 hectares of forest were lost in Indonesia and Malaysia, and over 50% of that loss resulted from clearances of less than 5 hectares, perhaps indicating that there is a local need there in terms of using land for other purposes, but also indicating perhaps a scale of a challenge in front of us on palm or any other raw material where no deforestation commitments exist. So all good to have deforestation data and having accurate land cover information, but largely meaningless unless you have the supply chain information. And this is where Starling really comes into its own by ingesting supply chain information, whether that be palm oil mills or sourcing boundaries, to identify what is happening on the ground and in the supply chain for companies to take action. The monitoring basically has 3 kind of buckets of outcomes. We see situations where there is no forest and has been no deforestation in parts of the supply chain. But more importantly, we see areas where we have deforestation that are happening within known concessions or license boundaries, sourcing boundaries, that are linked into global supply chains. And this is really driving action at a new level by these companies to take action with their supplier and so on and so forth until you get back to the ground to ask questions about, have you done a high carbon stock assessment and high conservation value? Why is that deforestation happening? And start to find appropriate actions to eliminate further deforestation. We also see instances where there's large deforestation and we don't know if that is for palm or if it is for the palm oil mill nearby, as you can see on the right-hand side of this screen. But this also is driving better action where companies are engaging with suppliers to ask less pointed questions, but important questions to help those suppliers to investigate why those deforestation events are happening. Stepping out of the sort of sourcing boundaries, supply chain is to take a global perspective. And today, Starling is mapping all of the palm production regions around the world. You can see on screen here these little bubbles representing the various number of palm oil mills that exist in these regions. And this is enabling companies to take more targeted action, not just in Indonesia or Malaysia. Palm oil has a deforestation footprint way beyond Indonesia and Malaysia, and Starling is enabling these companies to look at what's happening in my Mexican supply chain, my Guatemalan, my Nigerian, my Liberian part of the supply chain. Move to the next. Finally, I would say that the companies have an unprecedented level of access to accurate deforestation data to analyse their supply chain against. And I feel that no matter where a company is on its no deforestation journey, good data is critical for driving strategy and resourcing engagements to ensure that your no deforestation commitments are being met. There are challenges. I would be the first to admit that, and I think we'll get into some of those challenges today. But I think these are important opportunities for collaboration with suppliers, with producers, with NGOs, and perhaps even governments to find solutions to move forward more rapidly than perhaps we have in the last 5 years. I know December 2020 is just around the corner, 6 months away. And many of our no deforestation commitments are coming to an end then. So we have an opportunity in the next 6 months to really accelerate what we can do today to verify more and more of that part of the supply chain as deforestation free. I look forward to further discussion with after the following speakers. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Rob. Thanks for setting the context for today's session. We'll now go straight over to Phil, who from Mighty Earth will share his views on where companies should be focusing their attention. Thanks. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. Does it sound okay?
Yeah, great.
My name's Phil Aikman. I'm a campaign director with Mighty Earth, which is a relatively new environmental organisation based in Washington. I'm based in London. We have people in other parts of the world. So on deforestation, we currently work on palm oil, cocoa, rubber, soy, and cattle. We primarily started our work on palm oil. We expanded our work to the other commodities. Next. On palm oil, since November 2017, we initiated a deforestation monitoring system called Rapid Response. Every month, about 3,000 plus concessions in Indonesia and Malaysia, which covers about 200,000 square kilometers. And what we do is simply try and connect the dots. So identification of deforestation to concession area to the group that owns the concession, linking the group to the traders and the biofuel companies, and then linking those connections to consumer brands. And these reports are sent out every month to roughly about 30 traders, biofuel companies that have grievance protocols, and our expectation is that they file those grievances and investigate them and try and resolve those grievances. Next slide. And on resolving grievances, we have something called Trader Tracker, where we basically assess how a trader is acting on those grievances that are being filed by Mighty Earth. And this is the latest data as of a few days ago. As you can see, the right-hand column is a percentage of cases that have been resolved. In some cases, quite a number have been resolved. In some other cases, very few have been resolved. And this is partly down to how companies engage with their suppliers, and also part to do with some disputed cases. Next slide. So on the disputed cases, we've filed quite a number of cases over the past couple of years on cases where the land clearing is not related to palm oil development. So a number of companies, such as the one on the cases on the right, they basically said that these cases are ineligible because it's not clearing for palm oil, and some companies have published sort of exclusion lists on their website why they're not treating them as a grievance. Next slide. So that's a broad overview of how associated with no deforestation. Originally, a lot of people were looking at the mill, the product level of risk, i.e. if the mill itself was buying from plantations that are involved in deforestation, or they're buying from third parties. But sort of probably from late 2017, companies have adopted a more group-wide approach where if, for instance, they're buying from a mill in Sumatra and the company's group mill in Papua is clearing, they then investigate that as a grievance. But there is a higher level, which is something we're going to talk to today, is really about the sort of the broader associated risks of clearing for any commodity or purchase of any commodity from a group that's involved in deforestation. So now let's talk about a few cases where there's been sort of these associated risks. So 2019, and we've covered this in 11 reports. There's a group in Malaysia called the Samling Group. They've been clearing a lot of forest that has been for timber plantations, and we've filed numerous of these cases. They've cleared about 5,000 hectares in this one Brunei since 2014, when a lot of companies started producing these deforestation policies, no deforestation policies. Next slide. So as you say, I mean, a lot of people have said, these cases are ineligible, but when they say land clearing is not related to palm oil development and it's not related to their policy, what they're effectively saying is it's okay for our suppliers to clear rainforest or violate traditional human rights, just as long as it's not related to palm oil development. And we've been challenging a lot of the companies on this over the past 2 years. We think basically their policies should apply across the board. Next slide. However, as a result of ongoing pressure on this case of Samling over the past couple of months, there are now 10 palm oil traders that now have suspended their business with Samling. Sindar being one of the instances that have suspended, basically said that Samling now needs to adopt an NDPE policy, no deforestation at the group level, not just for palm oil. So there is some movement on this issue, at least by a number of the more progressive traders. Next slide. Look back a few years. So there was a case in Papua, a very high-profile case of a Korean Indonesian company that was clearing large areas in Papua. Ourselves, together with Aid Environment, sort of published a report on this, and about 5 of the key traders that were buying from Korindo did suspend. Next slide. However, it wasn't really until the action of another customer of Korindo, not that they were buying palm oil, not that they were buying timber from Korindo, but buying turbines, decided to suspend Korindo, and that basically helped influence Korindo to stop clearing. And yeah, that's a more historical case. Next. In the world of the Forest Stewardship Council, which is a forestry certification standard, they've had what they call a policy association since 2009, and we filed a complaint to their system against Olam in Gabon, which was clearing large areas of forest for palm oil, but they were also clearing areas for rubber. So the FSC sees this as a sort of commodity brand risk, and they're taking this issue seriously, and they're currently investigating the claims and hired someone to do that investigation. Next slide. So Louis Dreyfus in the grievance protocol has his text, or part of this text at the back of the grievance policy, which basically says that when there's an issue with a supplier, they apply their policy to all commodities, and what that generally means is if they're buying palm oil from one company or one group, they will suspend all business with that entire group. One of these companies that I believe that they have suspended is Samling Group, and Samling Group has been involved in deforestation for a long time. However, other companies have continued to buy other commodities from Samling despite they've suspended from Samling. Next slide. So to wrap up, I mean, the way things are going, a lot of discussions with various companies and other players in these. I think basically the future is really where these cases gets addressed. There's the more broader commodity risk assessments that people need to make, and they need to address these other cases. Next slide. And here's some familiar names to some of you probably. These are some of certainly the ones on the left. They're all basically been clearing for forest clearing in Sarawak for many years. Some of these companies have go back almost 50 years. They continue and have been continuing. We've included these in a lot of our rapid response reports. Deforestation-free palm oil, well, it's still work in progress. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thanks for the great work that Maria is doing as well. It's good to raise the importance of those group level grievance approaches. So we're now going to try to hand over to Emily Kunen from Nestlé. It's possible there's a slight audio issue, so let's just give it a shot and see how we go. Over to you, Emily.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, success.
Okay. I apologize, everyone. I'm having a lot of technical issues, but hopefully this works. So I'll try and keep it brief. But it's a pleasure to be here today to share our experience with the no deforestation verification in palm oil. I certainly don't want to convey that we've figured everything out, because we haven't, but I think there's a lot of lessons we've learned through what we've been doing and a lot of challenges we've encountered that have taught us about how to adapt our approach. And so that's what I will share with you here. To start with, just an overview of the approach we're using for no deforestation verification. It starts with our use of the Starling satellite monitoring system, which you've been introduced to earlier. This system, we've uploaded all of the information about our supply chain that we have. So the location of mills, to the extent that we have it, the location of plantations, and we're monitoring the patterns of deforestation that are occurring around those sites in the supply chain. So that's a bit of what you see in the top left image on the screen, where you can see a mill, which is the red circle, some dotted lines, which indicate boundaries of plantations, and some red and pink marks that show deforestation events. So it doesn't mean that the deforestation events are necessarily linked to palm oil or linked to our supply chain, but it gives us an idea of what the risk patterns are near our supply chain, and that's a starting point for engagement. The image below that shows what we can see if we zoom into one of those deforestation events, what we can see visually about the patterns. This looks like plantation clearance in the example here. So that also is an indication of how we can start to engage. What we're doing with this is combining this information with traceability data about supplier engagement, information gathered through on-the-ground investigations, to create a better understanding of what is happening in our supply chain, how are deforestation events linked or not linked or might be linked in the future. And this is giving us a foundation on how to be able to act. We're going through every single mill in our supply chain, so 1,600, 1,700 plus, and doing this analysis, which is on the top right image that's blurred out, just an example of the detailed type of spreadsheet that we're looking through and compiling that data. What would be shown in green, if you could read it, is how much is verified deforestation-free. In yellow, how much we believe can be verified as deforestation-free, but there's additional information we need to gather. And then the red would indicate where we don't really have visibility to, and we need to take a different type of action. And this overall gives us a risk profile of the mills in our supply chain. Just a example pie chart shown on the bottom right of if we slice the supply chain in different ways, how we can see how to what extent mills have already been verified, can be verified, or need to have different action taken. This is a very labor-intensive process, I will say. This is not necessarily the long-term strategy, but we view this as a critical way of building the foundation for a future of more systematic monitoring and verification, which all starts with really understanding what's happening in our supply chain today. So our initial takeaways from this work that we've been doing is, first of all, deforestation is occurring in all palm oil producing landscapes, although it's not necessarily linked to palm oil or to our supply chain. So that means that we really do need to have a risk management plan in place. We're seeing that the lack of transparency about supply chains is inhibiting our effective response or our verification of those. And just to give you a sense of the scale that we're talking about, of the over 1,700 mills that we are monitoring, if we look at a radius of 50 kilometers around those mills, all but 10 of them have some deforestation since our cutoff date of the end of 2015. Again, not necessarily linked to our supply chain or to palm oil, but it shows you the extent of forest cover change in the area and the need for really understanding more of what's going on. The second point is that the forest frontiers are dynamic. So looking at just historical deforestation doesn't tell us what the future risks are going to be. To give an example, in Liberia, there's an area where we have 5 mills connected to our supply chain. In 2016, looking at 50 kilometers around those mills, there were only 9 hectares of clearance. Fast forward 3 years later to 2019, it was over 1,200 hectares. So our monitoring really needs to be both about the past and current events, but also looking at other risk factors that will indicate what might happen in the future. And then the last point here is that increasingly the deforestation patterns that we're seeing are small patches and they're outside of concessions, which is different than the events in the past, which means that we need to apply different tools and approaches to addressing it. Over 70% of the alerts that we're seeing are less than 5 hectares in size. In some regions, that can be 80%, 90% of the alerts that we're seeing. You can go to the next slide. So as we learn more from our monitoring and our verification, we're adapting our approach. These are a few examples of how we've recently been adapting our approach. One is to act more rapidly. We've dedicated more resources to data collection, analysis, and verification. So we're spending a lot of time meeting with our suppliers, in some cases every 2 weeks, every month, to go through the verification information. So we're seeing a lot of progress being made through this direct engagement, not just because we're meeting frequently with our suppliers, but even more so because of the engagement that's triggering between our suppliers and their suppliers to have more granular conversations about what's happening on the ground. Because of the small scale clearance patterns I mentioned, another thing that we've adapted is that in all of the smallholder programs that we're involved in, we're really integrating and strengthening forest protection components and bringing those two strategies of forest protection and smallholder livelihoods and resiliency together. And then because we're seeing multiple drivers of deforestation, multiple stakeholders needed to be involved in the solutions, we're supporting more landscape initiatives, reforestation efforts, and conservation efforts. So as we reflect on our learnings and our adapted approach, we have seen a lot of progress. We really would advocate that other palm oil buyers adopt these monitoring and verification approaches, these types of actions that we're talking about. But we are seeing that you can only get so far going it alone and working directly in your own supply chain. And so really a key takeaway for us is that more collaboration is needed. On the screen, I've just highlighted 3 areas where we think collaboration is needed. One is in streamlining the monitoring and reporting systems. So as an industry, we're much more efficient in our resource use around that and can dedicate more resources to action. We're encouraged to see that there are more collaborative efforts in this space, like the NDPE implementation reporting framework that's emerging to have a common reporting framework on progress towards no deforestation commitments. The second is collaboration to have more supply chain transparency, including traceability to plantation, information about parent company and group ownership, information about engagement on the ground, in HCS and HCV analyses. But those 2 first points are really just the enablers to the third point, which is the most critical, and that is collaboration for real transformative action on the ground. This includes where we see a really critical need for more capacity building for smaller upstream companies, mills, for farmers, for more engagement with smallholders to have their inclusion and resiliency be a core part of sustainable supply chains. And then more engagement on not just focusing on no future deforestation, but addressing what's happened in the past and having collaboration around recovery plans, around reforestation initiatives, and around landscape initiatives, because we know that this can't be solved through just vertical supply chain approaches on their own. It needs to be a multi-stakeholder, multi-industry approach in a lot of the origins. And so I will leave you with those thoughts, but I'm really happy to hear all of the input that the different speakers have today and take any questions that there are. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Emily. Great to have those practical insights to how you're looking at deforestation verification and to have these very clear points for collaborative action. We have time for a short Q&A now. We'll have a bit longer at the end, so there's some really great questions coming in. Hopefully we'll have enough time. We'll just take a couple now, have our last speakers, and then have a bit more time. So we've got one here, maybe one here for you, Phil, is around to comment on how effective you've seen supply chain suspension work to stop deforestation. So the question was written, does supply chain suspension really effective to stop the companies from deforestation, or how effective is it?
It differs per company. I mean, in some cases, yes, they get suspended and then the company realizes it needs to change. But there are quite a number of companies at the moment that are trying to implement NDP policies. They're trying to come up with recovery plans to address their liability. And there's a sort of ongoing process to sort of let them back into supply chain. So there's cases like ANJ in Papua, there's Sani Hatari Abadi, there's there's various other ones, but not in all cases. It depends whether or not the company itself wants to turn over a new leaf. So it's sort of a mixed bag. But companies like Korindo have stopped clearing. That doesn't mean to say that the problem is solved by any means. They have thousands of hectares of liability. They've got ongoing conflicts with communities. They need to find a way of addressing those issues. In some instances, make the shift that is needed to get these companies to change their actions.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. And we have time for just one more. So there's one here for, we'll go Emily first. Rob, you might have something to add. It's around what is the webinar, might come up later, the role or the importance of government engagement in deforestation verification work. So national or other governments in both importing and producing countries, what do you see as their role or what can they do to support deforestation verification in supply chains?
I mean, it's a critical piece of the puzzle. Right now, the verification work relies on kind of vacuuming up data that's held in many, many different places, including sometimes with governments. So there's a role to have better data tracking, as well as I think they can play an important role in centralizing and aggregating some of that data. And critically, what would be a real game changer is a source of transparency and to make that data more accessible for this type of verification work, and then to take action on illegal deforestation events.
Thanks, Emily. Rob, I'm not sure if you wanted to add to that. I know you've worked in this.
I would only add that really good really good land cover information is driving better planning at government levels. To date, we've seen that land is being allocated by governments that are on what perhaps was called degraded forest in the past, but is obviously holding rich biodiversity values and carbon. So arming governments with better land cover information so that they can develop spatial plans that reflect those values that exist in forests, and that are supporting the industry to move towards zero deforestation is critical. How the demand side or the importing side can support governments in Indonesia, Malaysia, and every other part of the world where palm is grown, I think is just a place where more attention can be put.
Great, thanks very much. So maybe time for one more, and might be a nice segue into, we have Daniel up next, who will be speaking from the upstream end of things. This one's back to you, Emily, on just if you could, asking if you can elaborate more about the smallholder project. I think, in general, how is your work with smallholders providing benefits to them while still trying to address deforestation?
Our smallholder dynamics assessment of the local communities and the livelihood needs, and that is we see a what we've been doing with integrating more of the forest protection component into those projects is really bringing the smallholders in with other stakeholders in sustainable land use planning dialogues that are very location specific to get at what are the critical challenges that are putting pressure on those forests. Is it economic challenges? Is it land use classification? Is it planning challenges? Is it financial incentives? And bringing in the right stakeholders that are inclusive of smallholders into that dialogue planning, and where needed advocacy for reforms that would actually protect the remaining forest in the area.
Great. Thanks very much, Emily. So we'll move on to our last couple of speakers now. To Daniel and Justin, if you want to comment on any of these questions as well, please do in your speaking slot. And then also to all speakers, if you do want to reply to any of the questions on the chat, in the chat function, feel free to do so as well, because we won't have time for all of them today, although we will have time for a little bit more at the end. So I hand over to you, Daniel. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, great. Can hear you.
Okay. Hi. Good day, everyone. My name is Daniel Prakarsa. I lead the efforts of GAR's Responsible Sourcing Team, a dedicated team of 18 supply chain professionals who are working hard to ensure the 7 facilities we manage in Indonesia deliver a no deforestation supply chain to our customers. In 2019, our refineries procured over 7 million tons of raw material from 470 mills, of which 60% originated from third-party mills not owned or managed by GAR. We are working closely with our third-party mills to ensure the raw material they produce are in compliance with, next slide, with our sustainability policy, GAR social environmental policy. Our policy contains 4 principles covering key areas of environmental management, social and community engagement, work environment and industrial relations, marketplace and supply chains. Next slide. So how do we go about doing this? Since 2015, GAR has conducted site visits to 121 third-party supplier mills. These visits allow us to baseline practices at the mill level, identify compliance gaps, and help mills create action plans towards achieving compliant practices within their operations. These visits have enabled us to identify key areas to support our suppliers and allow us to design trainings, conferences, and tools to help suppliers understand and implement compliant practices. 88% of our third-party suppliers have participated in our supplier engagement trainings. In 2019, we started measuring progress using the implementation reporting framework. A mill is considered delivering on no deforestation if it can demonstrate that all supply to the mill, both directly managed and third-party, is compliant. Thus, for mills, besides ensuring plantations under its own management are compliant, they also need to have processes with third parties to understand NDPE principles and the processes and capabilities to carry it out. So how have our supply chains performed? We aggregated procurement volumes of our refineries into a single IRF profile and found that 50% of our procurement volumes are coming from mills that are delivering no deforestation. We are working hard to get the other 50% to deliver compliant practices within their own plantation operations as well, but perhaps more importantly, also to ensure sources they don't manage, be it other plantation agents and farmers, also are working towards compliance. A key process of engaging these plantation agents and farmers is traceability to the plantation level, knowing who they are, where they are located, and how they operate. We feel traceability all the way to plantation level is a key process in enabling suppliers to be delivering no deforestation commitments. In 2019, we required that all mills supplying to us submit a traceability to plantation declaration, specifying the proportion of raw material procurement from estates, both owned and external, agents and farmers they buy from, and whether they have possession of concession boundaries of estates and spatial coordinates of smallholder plantations. To help suppliers connect with smallholders, GAR initiated Ksatria Sawit, a program which gives assistance to mills to register agents and smallholders supplying their respective mills. This program provides our supplier mills with dedicated field agents to connect mills with agents and smallholders, to enable field visits to individual farmers to identify who they are, get the names of the individual farmers managing their own plantations, where they are by taking a location GIS coordinate of the plantation they manage, and fill a questionnaire to understand more on their current cultivation practices. So far, this program is being implemented with 60 supplier mills who have registered over 1,300 agents and 84,000 smallholders. So what happens once you have full traceability of your sources? Possession of concession maps of your suppliers allows you to conduct monitoring and verification of no deforestation. This analysis was used using World Resource Institute's Global Forest Watch Pro software, and you can see numerous deforestation happening within the 50-kilometer radius of the mill, which covers a huge area, over 785,000 hectares. The mill at the center have declared TTP and is procuring only from its own concession, which is marked is a green area in the middle. Thus, it can demonstrate that deforestation events were outside its concession boundaries. Many mills are not yet able to do this process, either because certain portions of their supplies are not yet traceable with locations unknown, or they lack personnel with geographic information system skills to conduct the analysis. With suppliers who have full traceability but lack GIS personnel to do the analysis, we have offered to do this on their behalf. This, however, is hampered by a reluctance of plantation companies to share shapefiles, which are digital files containing spatial information of their estate boundaries. This is considered sensitive information, as in Indonesia, plantation land use rights are renewed every 30 years, and companies are reluctant to share spatial data of their concession to safeguard renewal of their licenses. To overcome difficulties in receiving shapefiles from suppliers, GAR is working to build capacity of suppliers to utilize shapefiles in their possession and self-verify using GIS software that their concessions are free from deforestation. They can use applications such as Global Forest Watch Pro to upload their shapefiles and demonstrate that there were no deforestation events within those concessions. Obviously, if there are detected deforestations within concession boundaries, the mill should take action to investigate and explain. These processes would also facilitate continued engagement between refineries, mills, plantations, agents, and smallholders to ensure no deforestation implementation. The connections established through traceability and monitoring will also be valuable toward verification of other principles of our policies, such as no exploitation of communities and workers. I think that concludes my presentation. For further information, feel free to contact me at daniel.prakarsa@sinarmasagri.com. Thank you. Back to you, Royce.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. And yeah, I'll hand straight over to you, Justin, ready to go there. Thank you.
Yeah, conscious we're running a little tight on time, so I'm just going to be super quick. So I run the Tropical Forest Alliance. For those of you who don't know, it's a public-private partnership housed by the World Economic Forum and brings together more than 160 governments, businesses, and civil society actors working together on all of these issues. So I want to just say, I want to talk about three things briefly. One, just reflect on some of the progress, particularly the progress on palm oil and Southeast Asia in the last decade. Secondly, just reflect sort of where we are right now, particularly as the world is in the midst of this extraordinary COVID crisis. And then thirdly, just a few thoughts on the path forward. So what we've had, I think, throughout this hour is some really good examples of where companies, and Nestlé, I think one of the leading companies that's done so much in cleaning up its own supply chain around palm, but also the work from companies or organizations rather like Earthworm and campaigners like Mighty Earth that have shown at the micro level what's happening around how we clean up supply chains around mills. And I think as well, Daniel's presentation from GAR, the extraordinary work that GAR's doing now around that. If you wind the clock back 10 years, I think everybody would be astonished at the progress that's been made and the presentations we've just heard. And indeed, if you look at those macro numbers, the deforestation rate in Indonesia is down by approximately a half of its long-term average, and from a peak of over 900,000 hectares per year, probably 6-7 years ago. The latest data from Global Forest Watch came out yesterday globally, and for the third year running, Indonesia's deforestation is down again, down to just over 300,000 hectares per year. So that's not to say that the problem is solved, but there has been tremendous progress, which I think is something that the community as a whole doesn't give itself credit for in terms of the progress that's been made. And that's because of government action, because of private sector action, and because of the action of civil society actors working together. But the second point then is here we are in 2020, the problem of deforestation is still very real. The overall number globally is still troublingly high at 3.8 million hectares of loss in 2019, which is approximately kind of where the world has been over much of the last 20 years. And a lot of that is still around commodities, although certainly not all is to do with commodities. But we're also faced in a situation where with the COVID crisis, many more people, particularly many poor people, are going to be pushed into even more desperate situations. And what we are seeing around the world, but particularly in Africa and parts of Southeast Asia and Latin America, is that where poor people have no other choice, then often the forest is being cleared. And as Emily's presentation pointed out, could everybody mute, please? As Emily's presentation pointed out, then we're seeing more and more of the alerts being for smaller areas of clearing. So often that is not big plantation clearing. That is clearing because smallholders are often looking for food. They're often looking for any source of income. And so the issues that we're going to be addressing, particularly, I think, and troublingly in this sort of post-COVID world where governments are going to be looking to reboot economies, looking to how do they create jobs and economic opportunities, I think the pressures are going to be even more intense. And the challenges that we're facing need to be recognized by responding with more of a collective approach rather than an individual approach. And I describe the last decade as been a decade where we've seen lots of individual action from companies and organizations to now a decade where we're going to need collective action. And without collective action, we will fail to meet the key targets of deforestation. But let's not forget, deforestation is only one of many sustainable development goals, because if we are not eliminating poverty and hunger and other critical issues for humanity, then we will also fail on the environmental issues. So the third point, as we move forward into the 2020s, we have to be embracing more collective action. That's going to require greater collaboration between private sector and government. That's going to require that there is clearer asks of government around why transparency, as an example, is such an important issue for private sector and civil society to be working together on. That's going to require more collaboration in critical sourcing landscapes where the complexity goes well beyond the individual supply chains of a company like Nestlé or Unilever or PepsiCo, or indeed any of the other supply chains going to other emerging markets. It's going to require new approaches to smallholders, because no single private sector company, whether it's GAR, whether it's Nestlé, can solve the problems around smallholders, because these are critical development challenges that we have been challenged with for decades and still haven't found solutions. So that's going to require innovative and new approaches around finance. Conscious we're at 4, I will finish by saying that the Tropical Forest Alliance at its core is around mobilizing, providing a platform for greater collective action. And if we do not embrace that now, and it's not easy, it's not fast, but if we don't embrace more of that collective action, we will all fall backwards in the next decade rather than build on the great foundation that I think a lot of what you've heard on this webinar illustrates we've had in the previous decade. The problem isn't solved, but we've got to go further, and we're only going to do that by working together.
Fantastic. Thank you, Justin, and especially thank you and well done to keeping to what I suggest we do is, for those of you who can stay just an extra 5 minutes, we might just do 2 last questions to our 2 last speakers. We will try to answer those other questions or send them on to the speakers, and hopefully you can somehow get answers to those. We'll see what we can do. So I'll finish up with a couple of questions, and then we'll bring this to an end in about 5 minutes. So maybe first one for you, Justin, if you do have a couple more minutes. You mentioned right at the end there about the importance of collective action and the role of TFA in that space, and that it can be challenging. I was wondering, there's a question there around what do you see as the biggest challenges to driving collective action, and what are your thoughts around how to overcome those challenges? As you said, it can be slow and difficult to do things as a collective.
It can be slow. One of my worries, and we're seeing it the world over, as certain fabrics, as things appear to be getting more challenging, the instinct for many is to be working on their own. I think one of the great examples we're seeing, and Emily might talk to this, but the CGF, which has long been this amorphous group of all of these companies that everybody thought was working together, the CGF has finally got a coalition of action of about 20 of the most committed companies working on supply chains to really group together. And what I see now is that group is wrestling with some of these issues, but it's really making progress around how it can both drive more action in supply chains, both palm oil, soy, and pulp paper packaging, the 3 commodities that the CGF is focused on, as well as then collaborate beyond supply chains. And what we're excited about is how we can work with CGF in terms of more of that government engagement, clear asks to producer countries, but also to consumer countries, as well as then more collaboration in critical sourcing landscapes, and as well as, I think, more collaboration with NGOs. What's the theory of change? We're using the same theory of change as we had 10 years ago. Now is our chance to actually examine what's worked, what hasn't worked. But if we carry on with just the same track, right, I think we'll fall backwards. So again, collective action is about working together and putting the common interest above the individual interest. So it's going to be hard. I think COVID in lots of ways makes it harder, but it also makes it more important than ever that we do that together.
Okay, fantastic. And I think that, call for collective action has come across very clearly today. We've heard it across multiple speakers. I think, as you said, we've got more clearer pathways through points such as the CGF Coalition of Action, as well as more clearer topics such as what Emily from Nestlé has raised and Rob raised as well, and specifically where collective action can be most effective and build off where we are today. So I think on that positive note, I know that we're out of time and I don't want to push it. I know you're all very busy. So just a huge thank you to joining. There will be a quick survey sent out to provide any feedback. We'll try to get back to you on some of the key topics there raised in the chat function, and a big thanks for participating there in the chat. And yeah, that's it. Thanks to our speakers, Rob, Phil, Emily, Daniel, and Justin, and to all of you who have participated and been present today. Thank you very much.